Okay, my name is Josh Ryan. The title of my talk today is Constituting the Vigor of Executive Authority, Veto Override Thresholds and Policy Outcomes. This is a project with two other assistant professors, Rob McGrath at George Mason and John Rogowski at WashU. I'm going to present some of the research that we've been doing as part of this project. This research falls into kind of the new research on the new institutions research on the executive. Previously in political science, in the past, executives have kind of been studied in an idiosyncratic way. There's been a focus on their personality, individual executives, executives in historical context. Recently, political scientists have been trying to engage the executive in a way that's a little bit more generalizable, a little bit more social scientific, rather than looking at case studies. There's been a focus on empirical research, and I think this project that I'm going to present today falls into this new type of research. I'd like to start by talking about institutional design in presidential systems. The two key characteristics of presidential systems are, one, that lawmaking power is separated between the executive and the legislature. The legislature makes laws, the executive enforces it. And two, each branch has the ability to check, that is, prevent the other branch from doing something. This is commonly conceived of as a negative power. The framers did this because the framers created this system of separated powers and checks and balances because they wanted to prevent two things. They first wanted to prevent majority tyranny by the legislature. They were afraid that legislatures tend to become tyrannical. They tend to impose their will on minorities and persecute minorities. But at the same time, they were also afraid of executives. They were afraid of giving too much power to a single person. And again, they had a fear, rightfully justified fear, that executives become dictatorial, they can turn into demagogues. And so by setting up a system like this, in a presidential design, a presidential system, they sought to ensure that each branch had its own sphere of power, but was also stopped from doing things by the other branch. You should contrast this, or we can contrast this with a parliamentary system where there is no separation between the executive and the legislative branches. In fact, the legislature, or I should say the executive, is part of the legislature. The most important formal check that is granted to the executive is the veto. And this is the ability of an executive to exercise a negative power against the legislature. Hamilton talks about this in Federal 73 and said, this is the ability, this is the ingredient, the veto, that gives the executive the ability to resist the legislature. The title of the talk, if you recall, is Constituting the Vigor of the Executive Authority. That is the veto. The veto is the shield that the Constitution offers to the executive. This is true not only in the federal system, it's true in the states, it's true in other countries as well. But crucially, the veto is qualified. It is not an absolute power the executive has over the legislature. In fact, the legislature can override a veto if it's able to cross a threshold. That threshold in presidential systems is 2/3. Again, we can turn to Federal 73 for the justification. Hamilton talks about this 2/3 threshold, and he starts by saying, well, perhaps an absolute negative, an absolute veto would be the best way for the executive to defend itself against the legislature. He dismisses this claim by saying it would be neither altogether safe nor alone sufficient, and it might be abused. And of course, the framers had experience with the abuse of the veto. In fact, Jefferson, in the Declaration of Independence, the very first complaint he lists is that the king has refused to give his assent to laws which is necessary for the public good. In other words, the king has in fact exercised an absolute veto over colonial laws, and the framers also had negative experiences with colonial governors as well. Originally in the Constitution, in fact, the provision was for a 3/4 veto. One of the people who initially argued for the 3/4 veto was Governor Morris. He said it would avert the instability of laws to be most guarded against. In other words, the 3/4 veto was a much stronger override requirement than 2/3, and it would provide the executive with much stronger protection against the legislature. This tension between how much power to grant the president, how much power to grant Congress is, it's critical to the American Constitution. It's critical also to other presidential systems as well. The framers are trying to balance the power of the president to stop a potentially aggressive legislature from abusing its power. But at the same time, they want to make sure the legislature can overcome a president, an executive who might abuse that power. This has implications for, as I mentioned, for other presidential systems as well. In fact, most Latin American systems are presidential in nature, and the veto override varies. In fact, there is nothing magical about a 2/3 veto override requirement. It is just what the framers settled on after initially doing a 3/4. They resisted that. They said maybe this was too much, and they settled on 2/3. This is similar to presidential systems in Argentina, Chile, and Mexico. Uruguay has a 3/5 veto override requirement, while Brazil, Colombia, and Peru both have a 1/2 + 1. That is a majority veto override requirement. So what I'd like to do today is I'd like to develop a theory and draw on empirical evidence to demonstrate the effect that these different veto override requirements might have, and answer this question about how much power vetoes and veto overrides give to the president and how much power they give to the legislature. Try to resolve some of these questions we have about the tension between executive and legislative preferences, given that we allow in presidential systems for a qualified veto, a veto that can be overridden. Despite the fact that this is fundamental, I've argued this tension is inherent in the American system and in presidential systems in general, we actually don't really understand how the veto override requirement affects executive power and legislative power. So I'm going to try to develop a theory that does that answers some of these questions. I'm going to draw on the pivotal politics literature and the bargaining literature and the American institutions literature and create a theoretical framework which answers some of these questions. I'm going to test this theory using empirical data. Unfortunately, this has been hard to do, and other scholars who have been interested in this have been really unable to do it. Of course, we can't do it at the federal level. Why? Because the 2/3 veto has been in place since the beginning of the country, since the Constitution was written. It's never changed. In terms of comparative analysis, a lot of comparative literature focuses on this tension as well. I mentioned some of the other veto override requirements in Latin American countries. Those are countries that also, by the way, have tended to have imperialistic presidents. That is much more powerful presidents than we've had in this country. It's difficult to study vetoes and veto override requirements in a comparative sense, simply because the institutional rules in terms of the legislative process might be too different. They're not sufficiently similar to allow us to make clean inferences about vetoes and veto override requirements. There's different cultural contexts, there's different historical contexts. This has proved quite troublesome for people studying this in a comparative sense. What I'm actually going to do today is I'm going to look at the states. The states offer a nice context to do this in. The states, there is variation across states in terms of veto overrides across states and across time, but states offer otherwise similar lawmaking rules, otherwise mostly similar cultures, and this is going to allow us to make relatively clean inferences about veto override requirements. As I mentioned, there is quite a bit of variation at the state level in terms of the override requirement. You'll notice there are actually 7 states on this map that require only a 3/5 or 60% veto override. And these are not small states either. We're talking states like Illinois and Ohio. There are 6 states that require only a majority to override an executive veto. And again, relatively populous states like Indiana, Kentucky, and Tennessee require a simple majority in the state legislature. Not only that, this is a debate that has implications for current politics. North Carolina didn't even adopt a veto at all until 1997. It went from no veto to a 3/5 veto. In fact, in other words, the executive in North Carolina did not have a veto until 1997. It can be overridden by 3/5. The state of Alabama recently constituted a constitutional convention. This is not uncommon for states to rewrite their constitution. Alabama's been working off the same constitution since, I think, about 1901. They're thinking about revising their state constitution. The governor, Robert Bentley, has been pushing, actually, for higher override requirements. The state right now has a majority override requirement, and he said, the veto at this point in time has some meaning, but not a lot. He would like that requirement to be 3/5 or 2/3. In Illinois, the current gubernatorial candidate, a guy named Bruce Rauner, he's running for governor. He might defeat the incumbent Pat Quinn. It's a very close race. he actually got a proposition on the state ballot as part of his campaign to raise the veto override requirement in Illinois from 3/5 to 2/3. He says in this quote, the governor is the only statewide elected official. By having a 2/3 override requirement, this would help ensure the best interests of all Illinoisans represented. Unfortunately for him, this ballot initiative actually got thrown off the ballot about 2 weeks ago by the state Supreme Court. But if he wins, and he may, he's promised to push this issue because he thinks it's important. He may be the first gubernatorial candidate in history to try to gather more power for himself before he's actually been elected. But this is an important issue to him, and his sense is that a 2/3 override requirement would give the governor more power. Is that true? Well, we don't really know at this point in time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw on develop a theory, and the theory is as follows. The theory first draws on the pivotal politics literature. This literature simply says, most famously articulated by Crable, that in a separated system, there are a couple key actors that must agree to policy change. In a majoritarian legislature, this includes the chamber median, and it includes, in a separated system, either the executive or a veto override pivot. That is, depending on the rule, who that person is, it's either the legislator who's at 60% in a 3/5 system, or the legislator who's at 2/3, 67% in a 2/3 system. But one of these two people has to agree to policy change. I'm also going to draw on the bargaining literature. And the bargaining literature in American politics with respect to executive-legislative relations says that although the veto may be rare, the veto override even rare, these things matter. They structure bargaining between the executive and the legislature, even though we don't observe them. The reason is both the legislature and the executive had common expectations that a veto could occur and the veto override vote may occur. And these expectations, they anticipate that these may happen. These expectations structure the bargaining process. That is, they think ahead and they anticipate that the governor may issue a veto and that they will have a chance to override. The way I'm going to do this is we unfortunately cannot measure we cannot measure how much power directly the veto gives the governor. What we can do is we can measure legislative coalitions. That is, the number of legislators who vote for the policy on final passage, who vote as part of the winning coalition. The basic theoretical expectation is that larger override requirements are going to require legislatures to put together larger winning coalitions. That is, in a 2/3 state, the override requirement is going to structure the winning coalition such that it's larger than in a 3/5 state and larger than in a majority-sized state. The reason winning coalitions are a good way to do this is because we can see the effect of the override requirement, the effect it has on the legislature. Do more legislators, lawmakers vote for the bill in conditional on or based on what the override requirement is? Importantly, a larger winning coalition suggests the policy is more moderate in the sense that it's closer to the old status quo. And if the governor favors the old status quo, this suggests the governor is getting more of what they want based on the veto override requirement. The other expectation I'm going to develop, and I'm going to show all this formally in just a second, is that the winning coalition differences exist conditional on executive legislative preferences. In other words, the executive must be far away from the legislature. The veto override requirement is only going to come into play when the chamber median, the legislature, and the executive are far apart. If they're close together, the veto actually won't matter, and the veto override requirement will not matter. Okay, so I already mentioned that the size of legislative coalition implies the extremity or moderation policy outcomes. Larger coalitions produce more moderate policy. The results that I'm going to demonstrate, I'm going to develop this theory. Empirically, I'm going to show that higher override requirements produce larger coalitions, and in the context of budgetary bargaining, the override requirement actually can give more power to the governor. It gives more power to the executive. And this is going to have implications for the tension that we talked about between the executive and the legislature in a separated system. Okay, so I mentioned I'm going to develop a formal theory, a spatial model to demonstrate these theoretical expectations. The first thing we need to assume is that the executive actually wants to issue a veto. This suggests in a one-dimensional spatial model, policy is moving away from the executive and toward the legislature. That is, the executive is not going to want to change policy in the way that the legislature wants to change policy. Okay, As I mentioned, I'm going to use a one-dimensional spatial model. I'm going to assume that the veto override legislator is pivotal. That is, the executive is going to want to veto, and the veto override is going to be the key actor who's going to have to vote for policy change. That person is going to vote for the policy closest to their own ideal point. The legislature is going to propose policy. The governor has the ability to veto and may veto, and the legislature can override that policy if they can attract enough votes to do so. The last bullet point on here, the governor's preference is exterior to the veto override pivot. This, in fact, is a necessary condition, and this is simply the idea that the governor and the legislature must be far away. If they are not far away, the veto override pivot is no longer pivotal, the executive is pivotal, and the veto won't matter. The override requirement will not matter. Okay, so let's start with a situation in which the policy outcome, the veto override pivot is set at 1/2 + 1. On here, I've labeled the point C sub m. This is the ideal point of the chamber meeting. I've labeled V sub O, that is the veto override pivot. In a case in which majority override requirement is set, the veto override pivot and the chamber meeting are the same actor. They are the same legislator. You'll notice the executive is far away from the chamber meeting, and the executive is going to prefer, the chamber meeting, I should say, is going to want to move policy to the left. The executive is not going to prefer that because it's going to move the status quo farther away from where they are. But in fact, the chamber meeting can move policy in theory to their ideal point. They can pass policy there. The executive will veto it because they will prefer the status quo, and the chamber meeting can simply override that veto with the exact same group of legislators. Importantly, this predicts that the minimum winning coalition, the smallest number of legislators necessary to make this happen, is designated in the space alpha, and it is going to be a bare majority. So empirically, we're going to measure the differences between this rule and the 3/5 rule. Here, the veto override and the chamber meeting are different people. And in fact, the winning coalition is going to need to be bigger. That is, if the legislature anticipates the executive may veto, which in this case it will, because we're going to move policy to the left, the status quo is going to be somewhere between the veto override pivot V sub O and the executive, and the chamber meeting is going to want to pull it to the left. The smallest number of legislators who have to vote for that policy in this case are designated again by space alpha, and that is going to include all the legislators in the majority override requirement setup, plus some extra ones, a couple more. Why? Because they have to go along, the veto override pivot has to go along with it, as does anybody else to the left if policy is going to move to the left. You'll notice I've also designated the space gamma. This is the gridlock interval. This is the space in which policy cannot change. Once policy gets into that space, the chamber meeting may want to pull it left. The veto override pivot will prefer that not happen. The veto override pivot will not vote for it. If the veto override pivot wants to pull policy to the right, chamber meeting will prefer that not happen. The chamber meeting will not go for that. Here's the 2/3 case. Again, the veto override pivot is moved farther to the right, closer to the executive. Any policy that's moved to the left outside the veto override pivot is going to need to attract the support of the chamber meeting, the veto override pivot, and all the legislators to the left of the veto override pivot. You'll also notice the gridlock interval has expanded here. Fewer policies are going to be subject to change, but importantly, the veto override pivot and everybody to the left is going to have to vote for the new policy if they want to pass it, given under the condition that the executive is going to veto it. So we should see larger coalition sizes here. To put it more simply, larger veto override requirements are going to require larger coalitions. George Mason said during the Constitutional Convention that something along the lines of, it doesn't take fancy arithmetic to know that 3/4 is more than 2/3. And simply put, doesn't take arithmetic to understand that 2/3 legislators voting in favor is greater than 50%. What the spatial model, what the formal model allows us to do is to prove, in a sense, that it's going to be a larger coalition and that the executive's ideal point has to be far away. If the executive is interior to the veto override pivot, the executive then becomes pivotal, the override pivot is meaningless. So that gives us that condition that the executive must be far away, and we will see larger coalitions in this, in 2/3 versus 3/5 versus a majority. Empirically, I'd like to start by showing, I'm just going to do a cross-sectional analysis of the states and their varying veto override pivots. So again, we would expect that 2/3 states have larger coalitions than 3/5, which have larger coalitions than majority override states. The second thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to look at the change in North Carolina to see if that produced larger coalitions between 1996, when there was no veto, and 1997. The way I'm going to measure this is I'm going to look at the override threshold. That's the key independent variable here, is what is the override threshold set at. This is going to be conditional on a difference between the executive and the legislative branches. I'm going to use divided government as a proxy to measure that. Divided government is not necessary. The theory is nonpartisan, but we can't actually measure the distance between the governor and the chamber median. Divided government seems like a reasonable way to say that they're relatively far apart across a wide set of votes and a wide set of issues. The dependent variable, as I already suggested, is going to be the size of the winning coalition. One other thing I need to say about this, the cutoff size for those coalitions, I'm going to vary. In other words, I'm going to look at winning coalitions that are unanimous, winning coalitions that are less than unanimous. The reason for this is because many votes, a large percentage of votes taken in legislative chambers, Congress as well as the states, these are what we call hurrah votes or apple pie votes. In other words, they're not meaningful. They are symbolic votes that are issue specific and are not controversial. The theory is not going to work for those votes simply because nobody cares. The executive is not going to care about vetoing. We need to get rid of those votes. We need to screen those votes out somehow. The way we do that is we try to subset the most controversial votes. And I'm going to do that in a variety of ways. I'm going to try to draw a subset of more controversial votes so we know they're not just simply symbolic votes. Okay. The cross-sectional data consists of data taken from Gerald Wright. He has coded all votes in all state chambers between 1990 and 2000. This is one legislative term. The reason this is cross-sectional data from one legislative term is because it's very difficult to get voting data from the states. They just don't keep very good track of it in many states. What we did as part of this project is we actually read these votes. There's a short description of every vote. We went and read the description on every single vote, and we coded only final passage votes. So we're not interested in votes on amendments. We're not interested in votes on procedures. We're interested only on the motions to pass the bill, because of course that's when the veto is going to matter. We're going to exclude a couple states. Or a couple chambers, I should say. There's one chamber that we didn't have enough votes, enough data, enough description in the vote to code it as final passage. That was the Tennessee Senate, actually. There are a couple other states with off-year elections. That is, they have the state legislative elections in 1999. We've got to exclude those votes because they have different legislators. We can't account for that. That might change coalition size. As I indicated, the winning coalition size, we're going to limit to votes where 75% or less of legislators voted for the bill. The reason we're going to do that is we're trying to screen out non-substantive symbolic votes. By the way, this cutoff is somewhat arbitrary. Different analysts use different cutoffs. It's not uncommon to try to screen out these votes. Some analysts use less than 70%, some use a little bit more. Our results, I'm going to show you 75%. Our results work from 70 to 80%. They are not sensitive to the cutoff you use. So I want to hopefully assure you that this is not specific to the 75% cutoff. Okay, so oops, went backwards. Okay. These are the regression models for the results. In the first model, you'll notice the first two models are under divided government. That's our proxy for the difference between the executive and legislative branches. The first model is just going to include a dummy variable for supermajority. The 1/2 plus 1 states are excluded, so the supermajority is in reference to those states. The second model, I dummy out the 3/5 and 2/3 requirement. Again, the majority is excluded. Those coefficients there are statistically significant and positive, which suggests that, in fact, higher override requirements, the 2/3, produces a larger coalition than a majority override requirement. The dependent variable is in a percentage of number of legislators, so we can interpret these directly. A 2/3 override requirement produces a coalition size that's about 2.1% larger than a majority override requirement. A 3/5 requirement produces a coalition size that's about 1.7% larger. By the way, we also did an F test. We would expect the 3/5 to be statistically different from 2/3. They are not, although they are very close to being different to each other, but they are not statistically different. So what we see is that under divided government, under the condition in which the executive and legislature are far apart, different veto override requirements produce different legislative outcomes. In the average chamber, which has about 110 members, 2.1% increase is adding about 3 to 4 members to the winning coalition. That's a large substantive effect, about 3 members. Okay, cross-sectional analyses have their limitations. That's important evidence, but it would behoove me to look at another condition, another situation that maybe can provide a case study, a little bit more evidence, and I'm going to use North Carolina. Now, North Carolina adopted the veto, as I suggested, in 1997. That's the first year they had the veto available to the governor. Fortunately for me, the political condition in North Carolina stayed almost exactly the same pre-veto and post-veto. The governor was the same, the House was controlled by Republicans, the Senate was controlled by Democrats, fortunately as well. This is divided government. This is the condition under which we would expect the veto override requirement to be meaningful. And in fact, I can simply compare coalition sizes pre-veto, post-veto, treat this as a natural experiment. And in fact, this is what we see. The distributions on the left give the House and Senate pre-veto, on the right, the House and Senate post-veto. The distribution sizes are significantly larger after the veto. You will see the sample, there are different cutoffs used, all votes, non-unanimous votes, coalition sizes under 95%, begin to screen out symbolic votes. Unfortunately, as you noticed during the cross-sectional data, the coalition size was 75%. We don't have enough votes here to do a screening, a cutoff that low. So I'm just gonna stop at 95%. And you'll see the differences pre-veto and post-veto in both the House and the Senate are statistically different at the 0.05 level. For everything except in the Senate, for coalition sizes below 0.95, it's statistically different at the 0.1 level. There's simply not a lot of votes there. This is pretty strong evidence, however, that the coalition sizes in North Carolina dramatically changed as a result of the addition of the veto between 1996 and 1997. There's really no other change that could have been driving this result. The veto is commonly considered to be a negative power. That is, it allows the executive to check the power of the legislature. Again, Hamilton in Federal 73 talks about the negative, power of returning bills, power of preventing bills from becoming law. Can the veto and the override requirement actually provide the governor with a positive power? That is, can the override requirement associated with the veto give the governor, the executive, a stronger bargaining tool? That's what I'd like to look at now. And if this is the case, under what conditions? Now, this is important because if it turns out the veto override requirement makes a stronger governor, this would suggest that the governor has more effect on policy outcomes under different override requirement schemes. It has implications for attributing responsibility for policy outcomes, has implications for popularity. So this is really an important question. Simply put, what I'm going to suggest is that higher override requirements empower the governor more. That is, executives are going to be more likely, more successful in getting their preferred policies when the legislature, it is more difficult for the legislature to override their veto. And in this sense, it's a positive power. It's not necessarily about the override itself or the veto itself. It's about the anticipation that the governor is going to be able to exercise a positive power. The way I'm going to do this is I'm going to look at the budgetary process in the states. Budgets are a good way to do this for a couple of reasons. The process works as follows at the federal level as well as at the state level. The governor proposes a budget, the legislature works off the governor's proposal, modifies the budget, changes it, they pass the budget. The governor then has the ability to sign or veto that budget. And of course, a veto override is possible in the case that the governor vetoes it. Budgetary data provides us with an exact measure of the governor's preferred proposal and what's actually enacted, so the difference between those two. This idea of gubernatorial success or executive success more broadly has been studied in quite some detail, commonly used in the comparative literature in Latin America and even in the American politics literature, are things like executive batting averages. That is, how often is the executive successful in getting a bill passed? This has some endogeneity and selection problems. It's the case that, of course, executives are more likely to take a stance on a bill if they think it has a good chance of getting passed. Budgetary data avoids these issues, and the reason is because executives have to propose a budget. They don't have a choice. They've got to propose a budget, and the legislature must enact that budget eventually. And if they don't, there is an extreme reversion point, which means simply that there is no budget passed and there can be a government shutdown, state workers cannot get paid, etc. And that is also true at the federal level, as we've seen recently. Okay, simply put, again, the theory is, let's take a majority override state. You'll notice the difference between the chamber meeting and the executive here. The executive can propose a budget at E, the chamber meeting can pass a budget at their ideal point C sub M, the executive can veto that budget, and the chamber meeting can simply override the budget, and the budget will exist at C sub M, also the veto override pivot. In other words, the chamber meeting is going to get a budget passed that is much farther away from the executive than it would, for example, if the veto override pivot was 2/3. Now, in this case, notice the executive may propose a budget at E. During the bargaining process, the chamber may pass a budget that is a little bit farther to the left, closer to the veto override pivot. The executive may even veto that budget, but importantly, the budget must satisfy the veto override pivot. That is, the veto override pivot must be relatively close to where the final budget ends up. Even if it's the case that there's a veto and the veto override pivot overrides the veto, notice where the budget's going to end up. It's going to end up close to the veto override pivot, V sub O, much closer to the executive's preferences. In short, we should see budgets that look much more like the executive's preferences than in a 2/3 override requirement state versus a majority override requirement state. And of course, 3/5 is going to be somewhere in the middle. Okay, the data I collected is time series cross-sectional budgetary data. It comes from the Fiscal Survey of the States. They actually collect the governor's proposed budget and eventually the state's enacted budget. We've got it for 1997 from 2011. That's the data I'm going to use. There's one observation for every year, including most states, but not all states. I have to account for some state-specific rules and quirks in the budgeting process. States do this a little bit differently in certain states. Importantly, a couple states actually require a supermajority to pass the budget in the legislature. Those states I'm going to have to deal with a little bit differently because that's going to confound the results of the veto override requirement. A couple states are excluded. Alaska, Wyoming are excluded. Nebraska is excluded. Alaska and Wyoming depend heavily on severance taxes from oil, gas, and coal. Their budgets tend to fluctuate dramatically year to year. That's going to make the data not behave very well. So we're going to exclude those states. Nebraska, of course, has a unicameral legislature. Maryland's going to be excluded. Maryland, the governor is actually not allowed to veto the budget. They propose it, the legislature passes it. Once they pass it, it takes effect. One of the other things I want to say is I'm also going to take a subsample of states in which the governor proposed a budget that was less than the enacted budget. Keewan and McCubbins, they study, in their study of budgets, they propose a distributive model as opposed to the ideological model, that is the pivotal politics model. And they simply suggest the veto is only going to come into play when the governor prefers less than the legislature. Why? Because if your starting point is 0, when the governor prefers less, they can veto a high budget amount. If the governor prefers more, the legislature can't do enough, so the governor will never veto it. Simply put, I'm going to account for this by looking by taking a subsample of only those states in which the governor proposes less than what's eventually enacted. Again, the key independent variable here is the override threshold. The dependent variable is the absolute difference between the governor's proposed and enacted budgets, and I'm going to do that per capita. Here's a summary of the data. This is time series data. This is an average across all states of the governor's proposed and enacted budgets. You'll see they track pretty closely together. This is per capita, by the way. You'll see that in per capita spending, budgets have tended to increase. You can see the decline as a result of the 2009 recession. The empirical results are as follows. Again, the 1/2 + 1 override requirement is going to be excluded. In the first model, states with supermajority budgetary requirements are excluded. In the second, they are included. And we simply code those states as either having a 2/3 or 3/5 requirement. Most of them have a 2/3 requirement. And you'll notice, and by the way, columns 3 and 4 are situations in which the governor proposed and enact a budget that was less than what was enacted. You'll notice the results are statistically significant and they're negative and they're relatively consistent. They're very consistent, I should say, across all 4 models. The way to interpret the dependent variable here is the difference between the governor's proposed budget and enacted budget. A negative coefficient indicates the governor was more successful. So all the negative coefficients here tell us is that the governor's proposed the state's enacted budget was much closer to the governor's proposed budget. You'll notice the substantive effect here is quite large. I'm going to talk about that more in a second. Of the other measures, only legislative professionalism has an effect that's quite as strong, although it's often not statistically significant. Lab gubernatorial success is included, but this variable performs quite well relative to the other variables. Here's the substantive effect size. In fact, budgets change by about $20 to $33 per capita. In other words, in states with a 2/3 override requirement, the governor is $20 to $33 more successful per capita than in states with a majority override requirement. So let's compare Alabama and Louisiana. Alabama and Louisiana have about the same population, so they're relatively easy to make comparisons between. Alabama, however, has a majority override requirement. This suggests that Robert Bentley is between $96 and $158 million less successful in getting his budgetary preferences enacted into law than Bobby Jindal. So you can now understand why Robert Bentley wants to increase the override requirement in Alabama. One of the things I also want to point out is that the 3/5 override was negative in the models, but not statistically significant. Now, why is that? We would expect the 3/5 override to also be negative and significant. Well, we don't have a lot of states with 3/5 override, first of all. And unfortunately, many of those states also have a supermajority budget requirement. So I think this is a problem of empirical leverage. So for example, Maryland, which we exclude, has a 3/5 override requirement. Illinois has a 3/5 override requirement, but they also require 2/3 to pass a budget. So they're counted basically as a 2/3 state. So they're more or less thrown out. Arkansas requires supermajority to pass a budget. So we just don't have a lot of empirical leverage on 3/5 states, unfortunately. And that's probably reducing the size of the effects. Even though they're negative, they're not significant. To summarize, do states with higher veto override thresholds have larger winning coalitions? Yes, they do. Conditional on the preferences of the executive and legislative branches. It only matters if they're far away, under a situation like divided government. That's the negative power aspect. What about the positive power? The veto does empower the executive during budgetary bargaining. And we may be able to infer under other legislative bargaining situations. However, I only have empirical evidence for 2/3 versus majority, not a 3/5. Again, so it's a qualified yes, but again, this is probably an empirical problem rather than a theoretical problem. Okay, do override requirements matter? Yes, they do. Let's just ask these three governors. On the left, we have James Nixon. He's the governor of Missouri. He's a Democrat. He faces a unified Republican legislature. The Republican legislature actually has 2/3 majority in both chambers, so this is a veto-proof majority. In 2013, this legislature passed a lot of anti-tax bills and conservative bills, right? Bills enacting their conservative policy preferences. They didn't think Nixon would veto them. He vetoed all of them. Unfortunately, because the leaders of these bills were so conservative, they even lost a couple of Republicans. They didn't have a large enough coalition to override his veto. They came back in 2014. One of the key bills that they repassed was a law allowing teachers to carry concealed weapons in classrooms. They moderated that bill ever so slightly to attract the support of other Republican legislators. Governor Nixon vetoed that bill again, and he had it overridden. But it was hard, it was very difficult, and the governor was able to produce slightly more moderate policy. In the middle pane, we have Mike Beebe. He is the governor of Arkansas. He is a Democrat. He's facing, again, a Republican legislature. Arkansas is a majority override state. Mike Beebe vetoed a bill that would have had put very strong restrictions on IDs to vote. Many have called this the strongest voter ID requirement law in the country. He vetoed the bill, but his veto was overridden by a majority. Why? Well, and if Mike Beebe had a 3/5 override requirement or a 2/3 override requirement, his veto would have been sustained. On the right, finally, we have Beverly Perdue. She is the former governor of North Carolina. She only lasted one term. She decided not to run again. She was a Democrat. She had the misfortune of taking office in 2009, right as the crash happened. So she ended up vetoing both the 2011 and 2012 budgets passed by Republican legislatures, the Republican controlled legislatures in North Carolina. Both budgets, North Carolina is a 3/5 override state. Both budgets were overridden by a single vote. The Republicans had only a single vote veto-proof majority, a 3/5 majority in both cases. And Beverly Perdue eventually became known as the veto governor because she consistently vetoed bills and she had them pretty consistently overridden. Again, this would not have happened to her if she'd been in a 2/3 state. What conclusions can we draw? Well, if we think back about what the framers wanted, the framers were trying to balance power of the executive versus power of the legislature. The results here in the theory here demonstrate that 2/3 makes the executive pretty strong, not as strong as 3/4, but much stronger than 3/5 or a majority. The framers' intuition was basically correct. The higher you make the veto override threshold, the more power it gives to the president. Now, interestingly today, we have a much more president-centered system than the framers imagined. They imagined the legislature to be the most powerful branch. Today, we tend to think of the president as being the most powerful branch. Perhaps a 3/5 veto override requirement would be something we should think about at the federal level to weaken a bit the powers of the president, especially during periods of polarization, divided government like we have now. The legislature, the Congress tends to be much weaker because they can't get anything done. The president tends to be able to step into the void and use his informal power. The 2/3 override requirement makes the president more powerful than he otherwise would be. This is not, the results I've shown here are not only evidence for power of the governor and the legislature, they also demonstrate the nature, the type of ideological change we're going to get. Though higher veto override requirements make the executive more powerful, they also make the status quo stronger. That is, they reduce the change from the status quo that we're going to end up with. They also reduce how much policy is going to get changed. Higher override requirements promote gridlock. They promote policy stability. And this suggests that the veto and the override requirement regimes, the institutional rules in the states, are important. They structure bargaining. They provide the governor not only with a negative power, but with a positive power. This obviously has implications for how we think about the role of the executive versus the legislature, how we think about who has the power in the states, how we think about gubernatorial executive popularity, legislative agendas, the type of policy change, the rate of change. It seems to be the case that we're balancing executive legislative power, and we seem now to be giving the executive more power with the risk that we could get rapid and dramatic policy change if we give the legislature more power and more ability, a weaker executive that they have to bargain with. With that, I thank you. I look forward to your questions.